This is True News, the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help us God. I'm Rick Wiles. Doc Burkhart is out sick today. So too is our control room board operator. So please pray for their speedy recovery. Since it's just me here today in the studio alone, I asked Matt Skow to put together a collection of interviews he recorded for the Greatest Reset film. Now here is who you will see today and what you will hear. Pastor David Lynn will talk about man trying to rebuild the Tower of Babel. Dr. Carrie Madej will talk about transhumanism and our obligation to protect our bodies as the temple of God. Dr. William Briggs shares his insight about how the news media manipulated the public with its coverage of the coronavirus pandemic. And Dane Wigington talks about our responsibility to be good stewards of God's creation. And former Freemason David Gray talks about his experience in Freemasonry and the dangers of pursuing secret knowledge. Production of the Greatest Reset film is moving along quite well. I expect the film to be released in early March. And I will keep you informed in the weeks ahead. Now here is Pastor David Lynn talking about the rebuilding of the Tower of Babel.
In Noah's day, no one believed him. The rain began in the middle of the day when the sun was shining.
I wouldn't use the term angry. I am in a perpetual state of controlled rage. And why wouldn't I be?
I would tell the people watching this in 50 years, 2020 was the year the world changed.
Global crisis requires global response, and that justifies global governance.
The world is off its axis. There are no rules anymore. This is about survival. This is about taking care of our family and our friends. Everything is off now.
The goal quite clearly appears to be reordering a new society, a greatly reset society, that is ordered after the image of man, not the image of God. All of the evil societies in human history went evil precisely by building a city of man.
There has always been an impulse in humanity that we could call evil.
Cecil Rhodes's biographer wrote an article called Government by Journalism. And for them, journalism meant propaganda. It didn't mean truth.
They're told what to believe by the mainstream media, and they believe it. They hook, line, and sinker. People believe that all journalists are honorable.
I mean, at this point, we're living in a virtual asylum of people that seem willing to believe whatever they're told if it somehow provides them a false sense of security. And I would argue again, there is no security hiding in your cabin on the Titanic. The ship is going down.
What you're watching now is the truth of what happened, from people talking about it who don't have an agenda.
This whole crisis, the whole thing, the Great Reset, behind all of it is a spiritual battle. Our enemy is Satan. This is an apocalyptic battle between good and evil.
There's no better side to stand on than the side of truth, and the side of justice, and the side of honesty.
The stakes are higher than they've ever been. It's at like an existential crisis for the species.
I thought to myself, God is blessing me to be on the front lines of this, and I get to go into battle against these people.
So when you talk about what they're trying to do to this world, I've seen something different. I've seen God move when we thought it was impossible.
That you're the King of Kings and you will create the greatest reset that this earth has ever seen. Amen. We thank you again. Bless this interview in Jesus' name.
In Jesus' name, amen. I'm David Lynn, and the ministry that I represent and that I lead is called Christ's Forgiveness Ministries. The home base is out of Toronto, Canada, and that's in a province called Ontario. And the ministry is focused on reaching souls, building and making disciples, and planting churches, and establishing the kingdom of God on the earth by bringing more people to the Lord and calling people to evangelize. Yeah, it keeps coming. You know, from the Tower of Babel, Noah, it's like you leave man to themselves, you let them have their freedom, they group together, they sin, they glorify their own bodies, and they oppose God almost all the time. And so when you have a preacher like Noah coming along, he's a hated individual. You know, so when you see Babel coming along, what do? They oppose God. They curse God. They go against God. They feel that they don't need God. And the danger with that is that when you reach a place where there's nobody above you, it actually opens the door for what we call a dictatorship, and oppressive regimes come out of that. We've seen that in communist Russia, China, Cuba, and just going through the course of history, every leading empire, whether it's Greece with Alexander the Great, what ends up happening, statues of men are set up in altars that belong to the worship of God. The Egyptian dynasty, men rise up as gods, setting themselves above God. Israel, when they started compromising, they start glorifying themselves, compromising. Anytime we forget the laws of God, it turns into the worship of man, it turns into degradation, it turns into perversion, and we become our own enemy. And that's exactly what we see in the United States of America. We've opened the door, we've compromised, we opened it for trade, we forgot about the principles of God, and so we started entertaining different forms of spirituality, and that has led to the change of the laws, which has led now to the closing of our own religion and this spirit dominating the country that once belonged to the Lord. And now we are in the hiding, we are on the fence, we're running, we're afraid. Not me, but most pastors, most people, they just don't want to get into a fight, they want to get a battle. And what's happened for 2 years? Churches have been closed. How can any real Christian find this acceptable? I mean, that tells me that perhaps their hearts weren't really in tune with God from the start. How could any real Christian think that closing worship facilities and limiting coming together to pray for one another and hearing the word is normal? It's not normal. And what's become normal is hearing the voice of the world, seeing everything else open. That's normal. But silencing the voice of God is now normal as well. And if the church doesn't go out and publicize his voice, this is going to be the new normal.
My name is Dr. Carrie Madej. I'm an osteopathic internal medicine physician since 2001, and I practice in Georgia here. And I'm here talking about this pandemic because I was invited to business owners meetings here in Metro Atlanta, as well as scientific meetings, World Congress meetings, and around 2013, 2014. And in those meetings, they discussed the future of humanity, how to evolve humanity. And they decided that they were going to use technologies such as genetic modification, nanotechnology, artificial intelligence, robotics, etc., and utilize these and meld these with the human body for many different reasons. Some were to improve the human body, other reasons were surveillance and predictive policing. And because I learned about these things, I did not agree with them, but I learned about them, and then when I saw this pandemic happen, And the advent or rolling out of these vaccines so quickly, I looked at the ingredients and I saw that they were utilizing things that I learned about in these meetings previous. And I was horrified and very upset. And then I had a righteous anger because I felt that this was not right to do to humanity, especially without informed consent. And I decided to start speaking out about it and educating everybody. Well, I was speaking up much earlier than all of this, so I'm not new to the game. I just wasn't on social media. So I am very familiar with what happens when you speak against the grain. You know, when you go against what the narrative is at the time, you're actually interfering with people's ability to make money. For instance, if you're looking at the causes of things, there's a solution, therefore there's no money to be made. So when I was looking at the causes of, let's say, cancers, or why people needed transplants, there's toxins in the area, or how do you get a heart attack or stroke, dental bacteria in the mouth. All these things are causes and you have solutions. Well, my fellow colleagues, as well as government entities like the CDC or the Public Health Department or even other federal agents would say, you shouldn't be doing that, or you shouldn't be talking about that. And in essence, when you push them to why that is, they're like, well, how are we going to make money? My own colleagues, how are we going to make money? And I just never stopped doing the right thing. I take my Hippocratic oath seriously. First, do no harm. I think every life is sacred. I believe that we have holy temples, and I believe that we are children of God. So that spiritual belief, I could never not help somebody to my fullest extent. But I do know that you can't work in regular hospitals or institutions. Insurance companies won't take you on even though you're saving them money. You get harassed by government entities. Your medical board can harass you as well. And sometimes people's lives are threatened personally. So I'm very well aware of those threats. But at this moment in time, I decided to speak out again, because this is too important. This is the future of humanity. Our lives are at stake, the way we live and who we are and what we are. And I, for one, won't stand for it. I have the knowledge, and that knowledge didn't come to me for nothing. There's a purpose to it.
My name's William Briggs, William M. Briggs, and I study uncertainty and over-certainty. My specialty is statistics. I got a PhD in Cornell from statistics, and my original lines of research were looking at global warming models and looking how poor they were and trying to understand what was going on. Why are so many people believing these things when it's obvious that they are indeed poor, and we could demonstrate how poor they were. So I got involved in all this kind of stuff. I'm author of a book called Uncertainty, which looks at the philosophical implications of probability, modeling, science, all this kind of thing. Now, when this Corona doom stuff hit, which was back early in 2020, I was immediately skeptical. I wrote an article very early on in February 3rd, I think it was my first skeptical article about this. It was called Unnecessary Panic Over the Coronavirus. It was very obvious what was happening. The images and things coming out of China were very clearly manipulated. I mean, you have a country of 1.4 billion people, roughly. You know, it's a terrible thing to say, but some people are going to die on the street. It's going to happen. And with the age of cell phone, when everybody's got cell phones and so forth, these events are going to be captured. And to my dismay, people on our side of what you might consider our side of the cultural struggle were taking these images seriously. They were believing this propaganda coming out of China. Oh my God, this is a terrible thing. Look at this stuff. And they got these guys driving around these vehicles and they're spraying the streets, and this must be the worst thing ever. And they started throwing around terms like exponential, it's going exponential, it's going, no, it just doesn't work like that. It doesn't, traditional plagues and infections and things that just don't happen like that. They don't occur in the way that these people were saying, and people from sort of our side of the story. But they were naturally skeptical of government and government response and all this kind of stuff, and that's natural, and they should be. But they believed this stuff and they bought into it, and that sort of increased the panic. And it immediately became political. And people like this guy, the author of The Black Swan, Nassim Taleb. He wrote an article basically saying, in his words now, you're a psychopath if you're not panicking. Here's another reason why we can't trust these people. They know it's not true. What did they say? Nothing. They let it go because it's for the cause. They embraced the noble lie. They think it's true, the theory, but they embrace the noble lie. The fabulous Fauci, he embraces the noble lie and says so. We're going to lie to people to get them to do what we want because it's for their own good. Yeah, it's not true, but we're going to lie. There's been so many noble lies our scientists are willing to tell us.
The root of collectivism, I think, is a combination of two things. First of all, there's human instinct. We are a herd species. We travel together. It's like a lot of species. They cluster together in herds and flocks for mutual protection. And humans have that as well. We always live together. We clump together. We travel together. We like to be in crowds, at least for mutual protection. We don't like to fight our battles alone. We'd like to have an army, and the bigger the army, the better. And there's an instinct to be overly impressed by popular opinion. You know, well, if everybody believes it, it must be true. And even if it's not true, it's better to be in the majority than in that dissenting minority and be outcast. So we have that instinct in us. And so that's one of the things that collectivists prey upon, because they know that there's a certain quality in us. And the other thing is, it happens to be just a nifty formula for enslaving people. If you can convince them that collectivism is being imposed upon them for their own good. And that's the trick of collectivism. Perhaps the most significant mantra is, we do this for the greater good of the greater number. And if you really believe that, as I did, it was taught to me in school, indirectly. It was everywhere you look. I didn't realize it at the time. But the idea that the greater good for the greater number was the ultimate ideal sounded very appealing to me. After all, isn't that fair? And I didn't realize that that was a trick that could easily be played on simple minds like mine at the time. Because any atrocity that you can think of, any atrocity, you can get away with it if you can convince people that you had to do it for the greater good. And that's the trick that they always play. And so they love to scare people to death. We're afraid of terrorism, we're afraid of a virus, we're afraid of environmental collapse. And so we have to do these horrible things, take away your liberty and tax you to death and regulate everything you do, because it's for the greater good of the world.
Do I think the behavior of those who carry out much of what we see in the planet should be described as evil? I can't think of any other word that applies. It certainly must be described as evil. And their driving motives would have to be considered in that category of evil. And I think the word absolutely applies. I believe that the creator of this miraculous, and it can only be called miraculous, this planet, this gift we were given, comes with a responsibility to the whole and to our creator. And I feel a very deep-rooted sense of responsibility toward that. I could have stayed here until whatever comes and not had to deal with the battle I've had to deal with for the last 20 plus years, but I couldn't do it in good conscience, and I couldn't face my maker if I did. And I felt a sense of responsibility to do everything I could to stand against the fading of the light, if you will. And I can live with that. I can live with whatever comes if I know I did my best to do what is clearly what should have been done in every way I could. I feel a sense of responsibility to every form of creation. And I use that term because I don't believe it just happened. When I look at, and I'm a student of cosmology. I mean, I'm science-based, but let's be honest that certain things of science, if you will, are anything but. The Big Bang Theory, for example, is simply all they could come up with. And it makes no sense scientifically at all. And the notion that, as I tried to express at the end of the dimming, that this miraculous planet with a protective atmosphere, with a magnetic shield that is stabilized in its orbit by a moon that without which we wouldn't exist here. If you look at all these components, the scientific odds, the mathematical odds of it just happening on its own is zero. It's zero. It's zero. I mean, there's statistically, that's statisticians would corroborate what I'm stating. It's statistically a zero that this could all just happen by itself. So again, the birds, the bats, the bees, the bears, they have no voice except for us. And we're responsible, I would argue, not just scripturally from a biblical standpoint, but all the major traditions would teach us this. The great teachers, the wisest of the wise, the spiritual leaders, the true spiritual leaders would teach us this. We have a responsibility to be good stewards of this planet. And that involves staying at our post and sounding the alarm, not just, again, hiding behind pulpits or pretending that sitting on a pew once a week is enough. It's not enough. And the forest is my cathedral. It's where I feel connected to my Maker and my sense of responsibility. But I couldn't remain there knowing there was a greater threat, man playing God with the weather, and that, as biblical scripture would say, before you knew, you were not held responsible. Once you know, you are.
I think that's where we think of things within people, and we don't think of things within ideology. And I think it's an ideology that's above it all.
Satan said, theology is politics.
You leave man to themselves, you let them have their freedom. They group together, they sin, they oppose God almost all the time.
We have an opportunity to create a nation in the very essence of Masonic morality.
With freedom and tolerance of all religions and moralities that no government can oppress.
I think the strongest case is whether this country was founded on Masonic principles is, I think, look at the founding document, the Constitution. That's what the Constitution is. It's a resetting of the moral order, freedom from the church to govern our lives.
It's total control over the people. Total control. And it's global. It's global.
This conference discussed how they were going to control the thinking of the world through the press, and how newspapers were going to be run by a single source, which they were going to run.
People like Klaus Schwab have been handed down this ideology that they don't probably fully understand or represent in the same way as their predecessors did.
I would argue that WEF is a front organization. They're the front people, the front groups for the same ideology and the same entity, if you will.
No other way forward but to call for a Marshall-like plan for nature, people, and planet.
I believe that the signs are here, that what we're undergoing now is a remote dress rehearsal for the rise and the rule of the Antichrist.
Armed.
There are two things that really had me back off from Freemasonry. The first one was the getting too deep in the esoteric side of Freemasonry, because I eventually got to the point where I joined an organization called BODA, that was Builders of the DM, and then that wasn't enough, and then I got into Wiccanism. So I was just kept going down these dark rabbit holes, and I started to have some very dark experiences. And I talk about a little about this in the video, and people always inbox me and ask me, well, you know, but what did you experience and what did you see? And I don't like to get into that because I think it makes the whole experience sound sexy, and it gets into darkness that I think some people may be attracted to. So I don't really talk about that publicly, those dark experiences. But it suffices to say that I had gotten too deep into the esoteric side in pursuing secret knowledge that it scared me and made me very uncomfortable. And so from that point forward, I decided to just be a Masonic politician, try to be Grand Master, and that was just enough for me, right? So.
Did you realize a lot of people don't believe in God until evil comes in, and then they believe, whoa, if there's evil, there's good.
Yeah, and I wasn't ready to believe in God yet, as far as a God that was interested in my life. But the recognition that evil is real. There's real demonic spirits. There's a invisible plane in operation beyond what we can see normally. That there's real demons operating, and therefore, if there are real demons operating, therefore there must also be a chief good working, a God, right? So I wasn't ready to believe in like a God yet, but it had to be true. You know, Freemasonry, they would argue that knowledge is not dangerous, that you have to acquire more of it, that there's never enough, right? But it goes back to Eve in the garden, and one of the original commands, you know, to not eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, right? So God knows all. And so when we try to pursue this life where we want to be like God and try to know all, have this secret knowledge, that obviously leads to the demonic, right? Because that's not our calling. What we're called to know is what God has given us to know through the scriptures, through revelation. God may give you some private revelation, but ultimately the scriptures, this is what God has revealed. And that's what we're called to know, because that's what's good for our salvation. All this other stuff, obviously that's not for our salvation. So why pursue it?
That's very interesting, that secret knowledge.
Yeah.
The knowledge of good and evil. I have to press just a little bit. I know you don't want to make it glorification, but can I get one story about where you're like, holy moly, I feel like evil is around me or something?
I guess one thing I could touch on as far as how far I went down into that rabbit hole of pursuing knowledge and was, I would say I guess this had to be the late 90s, maybe around 97 or so, up until the point that I was baptized, that I started hearing voices. And they were clear. And I would hear them often and a lot. And I just knew people were there. And they would talk. They weren't talking to me, but I just always hear voices. And so I just knew that there's a whole nother plane of existence. And it wasn't for me to hear. I wasn't supposed to be hearing people, voices, dead or whatever, or demons. I wasn't supposed to hear that. That wasn't for me to hear. But I couldn't stop hearing them. So and that's when I knew that I had gone too deep and that I just had to stop doing whatever I was doing and just be basic. So I really didn't have a solution at that time, obviously, because I wasn't a Christian. Didn't really believe in Jesus Christ. I didn't have a solution other than my own human effort. My own human effort just said, stop doing what you're doing because that isn't for you. Or those other voices I was hearing, I don't know what they were trying to do to me, but it wasn't good. They weren't giving me any secret knowledge. Like I could just always hear chatter, just constant chatter. And it wasn't internal. It was just like audibly hear it. So, but after I got baptized, I never heard those voices again. And that's why I call my baptism a form of exorcism, because it delivered me. And what's interesting is that when I encountered Christ was when I was in the process of committing suicide, because at that time in my life there was nothing else for me to live for. I felt that I had lost everything and I was ready to take my life. But in the process of trying to do that, it was when I heard the true voice, Jesus Christ, who said, I love you, he said, I love you, I am here. I love you, I am here. And that voice is what saved my life. And I believed ever since. And when I just asked the question in my head, because it was weird. Okay, how's that Jesus? And Jesus isn't real. But when I just asked the question in my head, I knew it was Jesus. And that voice saved my life. Where those other voices I was hearing, I don't know what they were trying to do to me, but it wasn't good. And just like I heard the voice of Christ, it wasn't internal. I could audibly hear it. I can't believe you guys made me do that.
Hey, everyone cries in front of this room. I'm telling you. But it's not me, or it's the Holy Spirit, I tell you, is driving this film. They were fighting over your soul, I believe. There was a battle for your soul.
I never told anybody that but my wife. So
The Great Reset, the globalist agenda, a relentless march towards tyranny where ordinary people are mercilessly crushed.
The whole world changed in 1 year. You couldn't make this up. It's a science fiction movie come true.
The disciples asked Yeshua, what's it going to be like in the last days? First thing out of his mouth, let no man deceive you.
The enemy of humans is humans. The people in the World Economic Forum, they flock to that idea.
What we want to do in Davos this year in this respect is to push the reset button.
The answer I'm going to give you now, I could not have given you 2 or 3 years ago.
We're looking at something that I think we can pinpoint with Malthus, Thomas Malthus, and he's the one who decided there's just too much people using up too much stuff.
Now, the world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, healthcare, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%.
This vaccination program cannot be about COVID. It cannot. The vaccine program must have implications far beyond the virus.
The stakes are higher than they've ever been. It's at like an existential crisis for the species.
The ongoing war waged by the children of darkness
seems to have reached a truly disturbing point.
In my mind, it points to the conclusion that this new world order that they keep talking about for the future is here.
Wake up. Wake up, because you will be exterminated. They will kill you and they will not care.
May this be the beginning of the true greatest reset